started. My name is Caroline Griffin. I am the Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And on behalf of the PHRC, I'd like to welcome everyone to our discussion today on sexual harassment and housing. But before I do that, I'd like to thank our ASL interpreters, our captioner, and my co-organizer, Director of Communications, Amanda Brockman, who is helping us out with tech support today. If at any time you have any questions, you can pop them into the chat. We will allow a few minutes at the end of the presentation for question and answers. We prefer to speak them out. Either is fine. We'll be monitoring the chat for questions to present towards the end of the session. And with that, I'll get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Caroline Griffin. I've been with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission in this capacity coming up on 2 years. I have 3 years previous, a year and a half previous experience at PHRC in their Harrisburg regional office for a total of about 3 years with this commission. I have been with the Commonwealth since 2007, mainly with the Department of Human Services and the Office of Developmental Programs, with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, and also with the Bureau of Equal Opportunity. So before we get started, we have an engagement acknowledgement, and that, as you can see, is a disclaimer to let you know that today's presentation, its materials and technical support are for guidance, but they are not a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and or applicable federal laws. I also at this time will let you know that our presentation today is being recorded. So I would like to give that disclosure out as well, and it will be available after today's presentation. You will be able to access the presentation recording. So we start out with Pennsylvania. Fair housing in Pennsylvania is your right. And today's presentation, what our objectives are, we're going to give a brief overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, sectors and characteristics of protection, and explain discrimination, talk about harassment and focus in on sexual harassment, talk about responsibilities of the person who's being harassed, as well as their rights and the responsibilities of housing providers and employers, liability and best practices, and also share some real life cases, some information around some real life cases that we're free to share. Okay, so about the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we have a two-part mission, and that is to enforce Pennsylvania non-discrimination laws. And those are the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. And the second is to promote, the second part of our mission is to promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. And on our next slide, you can see, and if you're familiar with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, you will notice that we've changed this jurisdictional map just a little bit recently. Without too many exceptions, this is how we determine, as complaints come in, which regional office would be receiving those complaints. And it is geographic. So you can see in the very dark, I would call it navy blue, part of the state. The western part of the state is our Pittsburgh regional office. The midsection is a light blue, and you might be able to find your county in there. And I know we have some people from Northumberland County in the house today, so that would be the light blue section, and that is covered by our Harrisburg regional office. And on the right-hand side of my screen, I'm not sure how it's presenting on yours, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but that bright blue is our Philadelphia regional office. So you can see we've expanded that boundary for our Philadelphia PRO. Also in the middle of the state there in Harrisburg is where Director Brockman and myself sit at the central office. And so we have our regional and our central office in Harrisburg. So a little bit more, as I mentioned, the PA governing laws, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act of 1955, and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act of 1961. You can see the PHRA prohibits discrimination because of race, color, sex, religious creed, ancestry, age, national origin, handicap, or disability, relationship associated with an individual or handicap or disability, use of a guide or support animal, and or handling or training of a support guide animal. Don't worry, we'll go over that a little more in detail coming up. I covered that pretty quickly. The sectors that are covered by the PHRA are employment, housing, commercial property, education, and public accommodation. You can see the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act prohibits discrimination because of race, religion, color, ancestry, national origin, sex, handicap or disability, and relationship or association with an individual with a handicap or disability. So here are those sectors. You can see clearly here, this is a really nice slide we have to depict our sectors of protection: employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodation, and education. When we're talking about employment, that also includes seeking, obtaining, or holding a position. Housing, and we'll get into this, of course, because this is the focus of our presentation today: renting, purchasing, selling, or obtaining a loan for a home. Commercial property, having access to or the purchase, sale, or lease of commercial property. And public accommodations. These are things that are accessible to public places or services. Education is attending public or private school, college or trade school, or university. So they are the 5 areas that we protect. I'm going to, on the next slide, put up our protected classes because I went over them rather quickly under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. Okay, so I would ask you again to take to the, Director Brockman put our sexual harassment protections fact sheet in the chat. I just want to draw everyone's attention to that so you can have a look at that and actually take that away for your resources today if you'd like to. Thank you, Director Brockman. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is select 1 or 2 of these protected classes, and I'll give you a minute to pop in the chat if you're comfortable. An example of how discrimination could occur in each of these categories. Now, just take 1 or 2, and let's talk about what could be discriminatory under these protected classes. See if I can pull down my chat here a little bit. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Lydia. Refusing to rent to someone who is pregnant. Yes, that would fall under sex. Wonderful. Great example. Do we have any more? You can pick any one. Changing pet fees for charging pet fees, right? There shouldn't be any fees for service animals. Refusing to add an accommodation like a ramp, that's a big one. 50% of the complaints we get in housing, just as a side here, are related to disability. And actually 50% of the complaints that we see across all those sectors that I just mentioned in the previous slide are disability. So that's a really great example. Thank you so much, Lydia. Okay, Anthony says discharging someone due to their age under the guise of reducing workforce. Yes, especially age 40 and above. Yes. Asking to fill race when applying for housing or a job. Yes, absolutely. So These protected classes, I'll give some examples as we're filling in the chat to make sure we cover them all, and forgive me if it's something we've mentioned already, but as for race, a landlord refuses to rent someone because they are Black or Hispanic, or under color. A tenant is denied housing because of the shade of their skin, such as being too dark or too light complected. Religion, a prospective tenant is turned away because they are Muslim, Jewish, or practice another religion. For sex, we had an example of pregnancy under sex, but another example would be a landlord charging a higher rent to female tenants than male tenants for the same apartment, or charging male tenants more to maybe have female tenants take that. Either way. Age, a landlord refuses to rent to a senior citizen because of their age. Disability, a landlord does not allow a tenant with a disability to have a service animal. Familial status is a landlord refuses to pay rent to a family with children, saying that the property is only for adults. And we see this frequently. People are still attempting to put these boundaries up for prospective tenants. National origin, an example of that would be a landlord refusing to rent to someone with an accent or from a specific country. Ancestry, a tenant is denied housing because they're Irish, Italian, or another specific nationality. Sexual orientation, a gay couple is told that the landlord doesn't rent to same-sex couples. Gender identity, a transgender person is denied rental because they're transitioning. Or marital status, a landlord refuses to rent to a single person or someone who is divorced because of their marital status. So I think everyone did wonderfully on their examples, and I hope that we covered enough examples here. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, because these protected classes, the protections we have are pretty robust here in Pennsylvania, as you can see. But we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between our state protections and our federal protections in a few minutes. But for right now, I want to talk for a second about the goals of fair housing. So what is the goal of fair housing? There's actually two goals. And we know, and we've been discussing, that the first goal is to end housing discrimination. And the second goal, no less important, but sometimes overlooked, is to promote diverse, inclusive communities, as in affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that means we take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access and opportunities based on protected characteristics. So it's very important that we recognize both goals of fair housing. So, and I did talk about this, we won't spend a lot of time here for the sake of time. That would be the sale, rent, and rental and housing related transactions, as I mentioned. The types of housing I didn't spend time on. So right here, I will let everyone know that that means apartments, single family homes, manufactured housing communities, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. There's two theories of discrimination, and they are, first of all, disparate treatment, and that is treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. And the other important theory is disparate impact, and that is a policy that impacts a member of a protected class that doesn't seem discriminatory on its face, but has a disparate impact on a member of a protected class. Fair housing law overview. So the federal laws are the Fair Housing Act of 1968, Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, of 1990. In the state, as we've been talking about, we have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, and then local ordinances that are sometimes offer additional protections that should be definitely checked out, specific to where you live. So Covered providers, the Fair Housing Act, federal, is providers with 4 or more properties unless they publicly advertise vacancies or receive federal funding. Under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, a housing provider only needs to have 1 or more properties. The filing time, you'll notice there's a difference. The FHA on the federal level, you need to file within 365 days of the last act of harm. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the complaint must be filed within 180 days of the last act of harm. So it's a shorter filing time to be jurisdictional under the PHRA. Here's the differences that I had mentioned. You can see federally what's covered. Pennsylvania has much more protections. And again, you want to check your local ordinances. For example, in Philadelphia, the city offers source of income protections in Philadelphia, and there may be other places, and it depends on where you live that oftentimes there could be even more protections. So it's worth checking into. So we'll talk very quickly about the discrimination basics here, and what I want to say about that is that the definition of discrimination is I guess where I should start. So that's unfair or unequal, often negative treatment of individuals. Unlawful discrimination happens when the unfair, unequal, or negative treatment is based on a specific protected characteristic or specific protected characteristics. For example, refusing to rent to someone because of their protected class, evicting a tenant due to their protected class, denying equal terms and conditions or privileges of employment, housing, or public accommodations based on protected characteristics, publishing or displaying discriminatory housing advertisements or notices indicating preferences or limitations based on protected classes. So we'll move on. Oops, my slides. There we go. Here's a few real scenarios you can peruse here. There's first one is about a person with a disability who needs a reasonable accommodation, and the landlord refuses, even though the request is reasonable and related to the disability. And here they're saying service animal or parking place. Sometimes we see the landlord doesn't even enter into the process with a person. They don't even open the conversation or reply to the inquiry. So when they fail to engage in the interactive process, that is a problem. Lots of times landlords need to know their rights as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming time here, but their rights and their responsibilities. So a property manager refuses to rent to someone over a certain age, such as an elderly individual, saying they don't want older tenants. A landlord denies a lease to someone because they practice a specific religion, such as Islam or Judaism, because they're an atheist. A landlord refuses to rent to a person because of their race, saying they prefer tenants of a certain background. This is discriminatory based on race, color, or national origin. So discrimination-based harassment, we'll get into the harassment part and then focus on the sexual harassment in a few minutes. So harassment is defined as unwelcome contact based on one or more of an individual's protected characteristics. Examples would be verbal abuse, derogatory comments, physical intimidation, unwelcome touching, and inappropriate electronic communications. Sexual harassment is also addressed. And there's a list of the civil rights laws right there that can violate. Sometimes it's important to note that petty slights or annoyances or even isolated incidents, unless they're extremely egregious, will not rise to the level of illegality. To be unlawful, the conduct must create a work environment or a living environment that would be intimidating, hostile, or offensive to reasonable people. examples, as we said, are physical intimidation, derogatory comments, but under Pennsylvania code, criminal code, harassment is defined as striking, shoving, kicking, or subjecting another person to physical contact, attempting to threaten or do the same, following another person in or about a public place, engaging in a course of conduct repeatedly, committing acts that serve no legitimate purpose, communicating lewd, threatening, or obscene words, drawings, language, or caricatures about another person, and communicating repeatedly in an anonymous manner will all be considered harassment. So we need to just take a minute and talk about the reasonable person standard. So as you can see here, that holds each person owes a duty to behave in a reasonable person would under the same or similar circumstances. So consider the victim's perspective and not stereotyped notions of acceptable behavior, like that's just guys being guys, or it's just girls talk. It was just a joke. It was harmless. No one got hurt. So that they would be examples of stereotyped notions of acceptable behavior. Oh, I got ahead of myself there. Sorry, I bumped it. So how do we describe harassment? Again, this is behavior that is severe, pervasive, and regular. That's very important, as our investigators here at PHRC could attest to. Severe means it sufficiently offends, humiliates, or degrades a victim. It includes most physical contact, threatening, or vulgar behavior. It interferes with the victim's ability to live in their home. It creates a hostile or abusive work environment, and it undermines the victim's personal sense of well-being. Pervasive and regular, it means that the behavior is widespread and it happens frequently. And again, we have some examples here. The physical harassment would be the shoving, pushing, hitting, blocking someone's exit or mobility, standing in a doorway so they couldn't leave, say, a conference room. Extreme forms of sexual harassment also could include assault or rape. Another important example of verbal, it would be offensive jokes, slurs, name-calling, mockery, insults, put-downs, intimidations, and threats. Demands for sexual favors, propositions, questions about a person's sexual practices, lewd comments, sexual insults, innuendos, or the wolf whistle, threats, or sexually explicit jokes. So again, talking about regular and severe, remember, this refers to conduct that occurs frequently and with some regularity. Regular harassment can include actions or behavior that occur often that may not necessarily be extreme or severe in nature. If the harassment of a discriminatory actions happen repeatedly, it can create a hostile living environment, which is what we need to also consider. Like for an example, a tenant receives a daily or weekly email from the landlord with discriminatory language, such as gender-based slurs or discriminatory conduct about their sexual orientation. The regularity of these communications creates an environment where the tenant feels unwelcome or discriminated against. So, visual, we do have, as I just said, some examples on the bottom of the slide of the written examples, but let's think about the visual examples for a moment too, because this is something that sometimes isn't considered, isn't as evident to people. But an offensive object or pictures being placed publicly is an example of harassment. Racial graffiti, nooses, anti-Semitic or other threatening symbols. The X-ray vision, leering, obscene gestures, elevator eyes, and or a display of sexually explicit pictures, objects, or materials, or sexual cartoons in public areas are all violations. And now we'll talk a little bit more specifically about sexual harassment. But before we get into it, I want to also mention there's new needs, all right, in our day and age for specific social media policies and revisions to current harassment policies to include examples of what's not acceptable because we live in the virtual age. So harassing coworkers via social media or posting content that could create a hostile work environment and posting content that could give the impression of discriminatory behavior all need to be considered. We have some court cases in our nation, two that we can talk about. One is in Oklahoma, and this is Hannah versus Northern State University. And this is a case where two professors made a Facebook post on how an expletive Indian was made a chair of their department, as well as other racially charged posts. This created a hostile work environment, which caused Hannah to step down from the chair position. Subsequently, even though the university knew of these issues, the two professors were allowed to participate on the committee that voted on her tenure, which was denied. Another case happened in Illinois. It was Ming versus Aramark Corporation. Sexual pictures were drawn of Ming on a bathroom stall and left there for more than a month. Aramark employees, including two supervisors, knew of them but did nothing to remove them. Photographs were taken of the drawings and posted on Facebook. A group of employees were observed passing their phone around during lunch, and other jokes were made, and no one did anything. So these were two recent court cases and examples of harassment and a hostile work environment and sexual harassment and hostile work environment. So, I skipped my slide. I wanted to, I got ahead of myself, excuse me. So, and we had some good examples in the beginning in the chat, and sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. So this includes in Pennsylvania sex assigned at birth, pregnancy, affectional or sexual orientation, including heterosexuality and homosexuality, gender identity, and gender expression, differences of sex development, variations of sex characteristics, or other intersex characteristics. Some LGBTQ examples would be intentionally using wrong pronouns, barring from bathroom of choice, invasive questions about sexuality, invasive questions about potential surgeries, invasive questions about physical characteristic, and overall embarrassing questions. So we'll talk about the hostile environment. We talked a little bit about the hostile work environment, and we're extending that into housing, okay? So when it is related to housing harassment or another setting made intimidating, offensive, or abusive due to unwelcome conduct based on protected characteristics. There is noted there the misery index, and that's something we use to talk to determine how intolerable or stressful the environment feels. You can look that up in the materials after our presentation. Consideration of the totality of the circumstances when assessing if an environment was created hostile by harassment includes how often did the harassment happen, how severe, was it physically threatening or just humiliating or offensive, and what was the context. A hostile housing environment is one in which the harassment or discrimination is severe enough and happens often enough to interfere with a tenant's ability to live peacefully in their housing situation. The conduct must be unwelcome and based on one of the protected categories under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, such as race, religion, or disability. I did include some Pennsylvania cases here. on these slides and some links when you get your materials that you can look up these resources and sites. So there's two, one in Montgomery County and one in Falls Creek, Pennsylvania, under the Department of Justice. One where the landlord made repeated unwelcome sexual comments and touched their bodies without permission, requested sexual contact, offered a reduction in rent or free rent in exchange for sexual contact, and retaliated against female tenants who refused his sexual advances. In Montgomery County, there was quid pro quo, which means something for something. Rent payments were forgiven for sexual contact with the landlord. He allegedly demanded sex in exchange for lower rent and for unassisted tenants, and overcharged HUD and Section 8 for assisted tenants. Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, you could see some recent, these were, I believe, 2023 and 2024. Some of the penalties paid to the complainants and the civil penalties for two examples here based on sexual harassment and discriminatory terms and conditions of leasing based on sex. And here is one emerging in Pennsylvania that is a Lancaster landlord, just recently 2025, has been arrested and accused of raping and sexually assaulting two female tenants and threatening eviction. And there's details there for those of you who might want to follow that case. So it's here in Pennsylvania, and these are very recent events and ongoing and unfolding events. So this is a problem in this day and age still, and we have a responsibility, which we'll talk about, and our rights, our responsibilities, whether a tenant or property managers, or just citizens and people who are looking to protect ourselves and our fellow Pennsylvanians from this type of harassment. So we're talking a little bit now about protective responsibilities. So if I'm a tenant, I do have certain responsibilities to protect myself legally and ensure that I do not inadvertently violate laws or other agreements, while also taking steps to preserve my rights, especially when dealing with potential discrimination and harassment. So some things that you want to make sure that you document incidents of discrimination or harassment is very important and very helpful to an investigation, of course, documentation. Understand and assert your rights under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the Fair Housing Act, and your lease. Comply with lease obligations, such as paying your rent and maintaining the unit. Notify the landlord about harassment or discrimination. Request reasonable accommodations or modifications for disabilities. Cooperate with investigations if a formal complaint is filed. Avoid retaliation after filing complaints about discrimination. Maintain a safe living environment by notifying the landlord of repair issues. And may use alternative dispute resolution methods. This is not required, but say mediation or settling in some other way. The organization is responsible for acts of harassment in their span of control, where the organization or its agents or supervisory employees knows or should have known of the conduct, unless it can show that it took immediate and appropriate corrective actions. So here, suffice it to say, the organizations have a duty to take reasonable care to prevent harassment and take reasonable care to correct harassment. So prevention duties on landlord and management companies. These are their obligations and measures to put into place for preventing harassment from occurring. These include provide harassment-free environment for all tenants, take prompt action when harassment is reported, create and enforce clear anti-harassment policies, make reasonable accommodations for tenants with disabilities, prevent retaliation against tenants who report harassment, maintain safe and habitable living conditions, provide clear reporting mechanisms for tenants to file complaints. Tenants need to know how to file a complaint, and there needs to be a method, and the landlord needs to respond promptly. Ensure compliance with both federal and state housing laws. Managers and supervisors should be proactive. When they hear or see harassing behavior, they must address it immediately. They cannot allow inappropriate behavior to continue, even if it appears no one was offended. And they most certainly should set an example for respectful workplace behavior. Managers and supervisors can be named in discrimination complaints for aiding and abetting in discrimination if they do nothing about it when they're aware, or if it's been reported to them, they notice it themselves. So it's an employer's responsibility to correct immediately and thoroughly address complaints, take appropriate action when warranted, take action that is effective, and the action should correct the harassment and prevent it from happening in the future and protect employees from retaliation. So the next thing we're going to talk about is determining liability. So if harassment or discrimination comes from the landlord or property manager, they're directly liable for violating housing laws. If it's tenant-to-tenant harassment, the landlords are not automatically liable for the harassment or discriminatory behavior by one tenant against another. However, if the landlord knew or should have known about the harassment and did not take appropriate steps to stop it, they could be held liable for failing to address the situation. Because remember, landlords have an obligation to intervene and can also be held vicariously liable for allowing harassment to continue. Housing authorities and organizations, in the case of government subsidized housing or public housing, a housing authority may be held liable if they fail to take action to prevent discrimination or harassment. So, for example, if a tenant harasses another tenant and the landlord's made aware of this, but he doesn't take action like issuing a warning or evicting the harassing tenant, then the landlord, of course, may be held liable for creating or allowing the hostile living environment. So if you feel you've been the victim of harassment or discrimination, how do you file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission? To file a complaint, you would contact the regional office nearest you or by calling the number there on the slide. There's our Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh information included there. You could also go to our website listed below. And while we have this slide up, I would also encourage you to check out our platforms. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, all of the social media platforms. So there's also information on those platforms about housing and everything that Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission protects, all of our outreach, and also you could get information for filing a complaint there as well. So what happens when you file a complaint? So the first step is, if you believe you've experienced housing discrimination, your first step is to connect with the PHRC's intake team. They will ask you to fill out a housing questionnaire and provide contact information, what you experienced and who you are filing the complaint against. We cannot take an anonymous complaint. We do need to have a complainant. The intake team will assess the information to see if the situation is something that the PHRC can investigate under state law. And if the complaint is then jurisdictional and is timely, remember we talked about the 180 days for the PHRA and Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, then the intake team will help them finalize their complaint. Then the person who has filed the person who the complaint was filed against will be notified at that point. After you provide the information to a neutral investigator who is responsible for investigating, if there was a violation of the PHRA, they will ask you maybe for documents, they'll interview witnesses, they'll hold a fact-finding hearing, or seek other ways of obtaining evidence. Mediation services may also be an option depending on the case and if both parties would agree to mediation. The investigator will also explore if it's possible to settle the case before a finding. So when we're talking about findings, there's two possibilities, probable cause and no probable cause. You will hear us refer to that as PC and NPC here at PHRC. If probable cause is found, then the investigator in the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is no longer impartial, right? If it's probable cause. So in that case, the case may be conciliated, advanced to public hearing, or be filed in court. At this point, the goal is to seek a remedy for the discrimination that occurred. The amount of time it takes to investigate a case varies. We get that question a lot because it depends on the evidence, the amount of witnesses, the speediness of the response, because remember, I told you after the intake portion and you file the complaint and the investigator helps the complainant finalize that complaint, it goes to the respondent, the person who the complaint is against, and they have 30 days to provide an answer. They can sometimes get an extension on that of no more than 30 days, but that is up to the investigator and how much responsiveness the respondent has shown to that point. And in that case, we do not get an answer after that time period, then we file a rule to show cause and we seek a subpoena to get the answer. So talked about all of that that I talked about on this slide was the probable cause. What will happen if a case is NPC, then your case is closed. You receive a letter from the commission explaining the NPC filing and what the finding was, and you can also you will also get instructions for your rights to appeal and so forth if you would not agree with the finding. What are the remedies under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act? This is not an all-inclusive list, of course, but these are some of the remedies that may be available in the sector of employment, or punitive damages are not available in employment under the PHRA. So here you can see cease and desist, reimbursement for cost of counseling, therapy, medication, etc., monitoring, policy changes, compensation for emotional distress. That is possible in housing. You can get pain and suffering and humiliation, embarrassment for a remedy, reinstatement of tenancy or rent reduction for substandard conditions, training, punitive damages, and reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses like moving cost or extra rent. So these are just an idea. And civil penalties are also paid if you remember some of those cases I showed you from the that were recently found under sexual harassment under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act at the PHRC. So to prevent housing harassment, some best practices are implement clear anti-harassment policies, establish these written rules regarding harassment and discrimination, provide regular training and education, ensure staff and tenants understand their rights and their responsibilities, create a safe and accessible reporting system, make it easy for tenants to report harassment confidentially, and enforce zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. Take immediate action when the harassment occurs. Maintain safe, inclusive, and accessible living spaces, and ensure that the physical environment is safe and accommodating for all tenants. On this slide, I would like to share some PHRC fair housing resources. We have free housing training programs, and they are updated frequently. And we do those trainings for one person or hundreds of people. You just have to let us know. We come to you in person, or we provide them in the virtual space, and we tailor them to your needs. So it is worth looking at our training programs and then reaching out to one of our outreach coordinators and discussing what those needs are. And we have formal training requests as well that you can fill out. We have monthly housing webinars, the Fair Housing and Power Hour, which we're on right now. We have a plethora of brochures and fact sheets. And don't forget, Director Brothman did put one of our newest fact sheets for sexual harassment protections in our chat, so you might want to grab that. We no longer actually have PHRC Speaks Fair Housing Forward. That was a show we were doing on PCN. So we'll need to take that out. But we do have our white paper, which will be re-released in a few weeks, upgraded, and that is the State of Fair Housing in the Commonwealth of PA. We also do a quarterly fair housing e-newsletter, and you can see example there of some of our resources to the right. And again, this is a little bit of a contact page, a little bit of information. We did mention again our regional office, but this is our address for our central office. It is important to note that we'll be moving over to the forum as of September 25th, where I believe the address is 222. No, that's not right. I'm sorry. The forum place, we will have that. I know many of us have added it to our emails, but we'll be adding it to our trainings too once we hit September. We're right at the end of August because we'll be within the month. Our first day of operation will be at the end of September when we move to the forum place. So we'll be getting some different phone numbers and addresses, but you can still contact us via the same email. So my contact information is there if there's anything I can help you with, and then our PHRC contact email is there as well. See the QR code? Thank you, Director Brothman put our new address in the chat, 555 Walnut Street, Forum Place. You can scan that QR code and let us know how you enjoyed today's training. Give us some ideas for future topics you'd like to see covered in housing, or anything you'd like to say. And with that, we have a few minutes left over if anybody'd like to comment or share anything or has any questions we could help with. Okay, well, if there's no questions, please feel free to scan the code, reach out if you have any questions or suggestions. You can submit them via email or, as I said, through our QR code. And I'd really love to thank everyone for joining us today for our Fair Housing and Power Hour, and we look forward to seeing you next month. These Empower Hours are held the last Wednesday of every month, and usually OC Mellinger or myself will be providing them. So it's been a pleasure to see everyone, and I look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you also, Director Brothman and Heidi and Jane.
Yeah, are you okay if we go ahead and end the meeting, or do you want to hold on a little bit longer?
We're good. I just had forgotten to thank everyone again at the end for all your help.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.